The Las Vegas Aces are crumbling, and Aja Wilson is feeling the pressure like never before. Imagine going from back-to-back WNBA championships to watching your teammates leave one by one. If we want to look at the Vegas Aces team from last year, who's still remaining? The MVP? Jackie Young, Chelsea Gray. That is not just a few players. Key stars, role players, and even coaching staff are abandoning ship. But why? Why are players choosing to leave a championship-winning team for the Indiana Fever and Caitlin Clark? What's going on behind the scenes that's making everyone run for the exit? In this video, we're breaking it all down, from the shocking departures to what this means for the Aces and Wilson's future. Let's get into it. Aja Wilson never thought she'd see the day when the Las Vegas Aces, her team, her dynasty, would be crumbling right before her eyes. The past 2 seasons had been a dream. Back-to-back championships, a stacked roster, and a city that embraced them as heroes. But now she was watching her teammates walk away, one by one, leaving her stranded in what was once the most dominant team in the WNBA. I mean, obviously we have to get better. We have to really take a sharp look at ourselves, look ourselves in the mirror, see our shortcomings, and then, you gotta make the moves necessary, whatever that means, to put the best product that we possibly can. It's not gonna be the same group probably next year. At first, the departures seemed like small losses, a role player here, a bench piece there. Nothing too serious. Teams change every year, and after a championship run, it's normal for players to explore other options. But then the big names started leaving. First Kelsey Plum, then Alicia Clark, followed by Sydney Colson, Tiffany Hayes, and even members of the coaching staff. The exodus was in full swing, and Wilson could only stand there helpless as her championship team fell apart before her eyes. She wasn't the only one who felt the shift. The entire Aces fan base was in disbelief. How could this happen? How could a team go from the top of the league to absolute chaos in just a few months? The answer wasn't simple. There wasn't just one reason. It was a combination of poor management, questionable contracts, a toxic environment, and the growing appeal of other teams, especially one in particular, the Indiana Fever. For the past few seasons, the Aces had built a reputation of being a dominant force. They were confident, maybe even arrogant. They played with an attitude that screamed, "We're unbeatable," and for a while they were. But that confidence turned into complacency. The front office started making decisions based on past success rather than future sustainability. And before anyone realized it, the foundation of their dynasty had cracks too deep to ignore. The problem started with the roster itself. On paper, the Aces still had their core: Aja Wilson, Chelsea Gray, and Jackie Young. That should have been enough to keep the team competitive, but what they didn't account for was how much they were losing in depth. Losing Kelsey Plum was a devastating blow. She wasn't just a scorer, she was a leader. She brought energy to the team, a presence that couldn't be easily replaced. When she left for the Sparks, it was the first real sign that something was wrong. Players don't just leave championship teams unless there's a serious reason. Alicia Clark's departure was another gut punch. A defensive anchor, a veteran with championship experience, she was the kind of player that kept teams balanced. Losing her to the Seattle Storm felt like a direct hit. Then Sydney Colson and Tiffany Hayes packed their bags, each heading to teams that were either rebuilding or positioning themselves for a deep playoff run. The worst part, the Aces couldn't do anything to stop it. Salary cap issues had left them handcuffed. Chelsea Gray, Jackie Young, and Wilson all had big contracts, and instead of finding a way to balance the roster, the Aces made a questionable move, signing Jewel Lloyd to a near-max deal. On paper, adding Lloyd seemed like a good idea. She was a scorer, a veteran with experience, someone who could help take some of the scoring pressure off Wilson. But the problem was simple. She was inconsistent. Lloyd's shooting percentages had been shaky, her performances unpredictable, and now, with her massive contract on the books, the Aces found themselves unable to offer competitive deals to the role players who had been the backbone of their success. That's when the panic started to set in. Players saw the writing on the wall. They saw that the front office was prioritizing certain contracts over team depth. They saw that the once dominant team was no longer structured for sustained success, and more importantly, they saw better opportunities elsewhere. Indiana Fever became the surprise destination for many of these former Aces players. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't even just about a fresh start. It was about the future. The Fever had been a struggling team, but the arrival of Caitlin Clark changed everything. The hype around Clark was unlike anything the WNBA had seen in years. She wasn't just a promising young player. She was a potential generational talent, a franchise-altering star. And with Indiana aggressively building around her, players took notice. They saw the Fever making smart moves. Natasha Howard, Dawana Bonner, Sophie Cunningham, all significant pickups. The Fever weren't just looking to improve, they were looking to win. Players who once saw the Aces as the best destination in the league were now turning their attention to Indiana. A'ja Wilson couldn't believe it. She had spent years helping to build the Aces into a powerhouse, and now it was all coming undone. And then came the whispers about Becky Hammon. At first, the talk was subtle. Some players weren't happy with how the team was being run. There were murmurs that Hammon's coaching style wasn't sitting well with certain players. The championship success had masked a lot of those concerns, but now that things were falling apart, those concerns were coming to the surface. Was Hammon too demanding? Was she unwilling to adapt? Did she alienate certain players? No one wanted to say it outright, but the signs were there. The players weren't just leaving for more money or better opportunities. They were leaving because something wasn't working in Vegas. Even team owner Tom Brady had to be concerned. When he invested in the Aces, he envisioned a dynasty, a powerhouse that would dominate for years. But now his team was barely holding itself together. The tipping point came when reports surfaced that Wilson's contract was set to expire soon. That changed everything. Wilson wasn't just another player, she was the face of the franchise. Losing role players was one thing, but losing Wilson, that would be the ultimate collapse. The fear started creeping in. Could Wilson leave too? The front office scrambled to reassure fans that everything was under control. They talked about retooling, about making adjustments, about finding ways to keep the team competitive. But the reality was much harsher. The Aces had already lost too much. The Indiana Fever were rising. The New York Liberty were already stacked. The Minnesota Lynx were making aggressive moves. The league was shifting, and Las Vegas was no longer the top destination for players looking to win. Wilson knew she had a decision to make. She could stay and try to salvage what was left, try to keep the Aces competitive, try to rebuild from the ground up. Or she could leave, go to a team that was building something special, go to a team that was prepared for the future, go to a team where she wouldn't have to carry the weight of an entire franchise on her shoulders alone. As more players continued to walk away from the Aces, Wilson couldn't ignore the possibility that her time in Vegas might be coming to an end. And if she left, it wouldn't just be the end of an era. It would be the final nail in the coffin for the Las Vegas Aces. Wilson knew she had a choice to make, and with each passing day, it was getting harder to ignore the reality staring her in the face. A'ja Wilson sat in her car, parked outside the Aces practice facility, gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. This wasn't just another off-season. This was the off-season, the one that would decide the future of her career, the legacy she had built, and the fate of the Las Vegas Aces. The departures had kept coming. The roster was looking unrecognizable, and the whispers about Becky Hammon, they weren't whispers anymore. They were shouts. Wilson had spent the last few days trying to process it all. Every morning she woke up to another bombshell, another player leaving, another deal falling apart, another analyst questioning whether the Aces were done as a dynasty. She wasn't naive. She knew basketball was a business. But this was something different. The Indiana Fever had become the most talked about team in the league. And it wasn't just because of Caitlin Clark. Players weren't just choosing Indiana because they wanted to play with Clark. They were choosing stability, long-term success, a front office that listened. And the Aces, they were looking more and more like a sinking ship. Wilson had spent the past few days calling former teammates, checking in, trying to understand why so many of them were leaving, and the answers all started to sound the same. I just needed a fresh start. It wasn't personal, Aja, but things are different now. I can't stay and hope things get better. I need to bet on myself. She heard it again and again, and the worst part, she couldn't blame them. She had tried to convince herself that it wasn't that bad, that Becky Hammon and the front office had a plan, that the Aces weren't just letting their championship team crumble without some kind of backup plan. But then she saw the numbers. The salary cap situation was a disaster. They had too much money tied up in too few players, and the worst part, the one player they had spent big on, Jewel Lloyd, was not the answer. Lloyd was talented, no doubt, but she wasn't the kind of player who could carry a franchise. And now, with her massive contract taking up space, the Aces were left scrambling to fill their bench with minimum contracts and rookies. That wasn't how you built a dynasty. That was how you destroyed one. The biggest red flag, though, Becky Hammon's silence. For weeks, as players kept leaving, as the fan base started to panic, Hammon had stayed quiet. No big public reassurances, no press conferences explaining the plan, just vague comments about how change was inevitable and how they'd figure it out. Wilson didn't buy it. She knew when a team was in denial, and right now the Aces were drowning in it. She thought back to the Tom Brady situation. The guy had invested in this team thinking he was buying into a dynasty, but now he had to be wondering what the hell he had gotten himself into. The lawsuits, investigations, and contract disputes hanging over the franchise weren't helping either. Between the salary cap mess and the way the front office had handled player negotiations, the Aces had put themselves in a no-win situation. They couldn't afford to pay the players they needed and the ones they could afford. They weren't sticking around. Wilson had spent the last 2 years carrying this team. She was supposed to be the face of the franchise, the leader, the one who stuck around no matter what. But now she was starting to wonder if she was the one being left behind. And then the reality hit her. She was about to become a free agent. She still had one more season on her deal, but after that, she could walk, she could leave, and after watching what had happened this off-season, after seeing how the front office had let everything fall apart, she had to ask herself, why should she stay? She had given everything to this franchise. She had led them to 2 championships. She had cemented herself as one of the best players in the league. But did she owe them loyalty? Loyalty to a team that had failed to protect the roster. Loyalty to a coach who refused to adapt. Loyalty to a franchise that couldn't keep its own players happy. She knew what people would say if she left. She abandoned ship. She turned her back on the franchise. She couldn't handle the pressure. But was it pressure, or was it just common sense? She had seen what the Indiana Fever were building. Caitlin Clark was about to change the league. The Fever weren't just putting together a team, they were putting together a dynasty. Natasha Howard, Dewana Bonner, Sophie Cunningham, and now Sydney Colson. That was a team with a vision. That was a team that wasn't just hoping to win, they were planning for it. And Wilson, she had to ask herself the toughest question of her career. Did she want to stick it out in Las Vegas, hoping the front office figured things out, or did she want to take control of her own future? She had always thought of herself as a loyal player, someone who would ride with her team no matter what. But at some point, loyalty had to go both ways, and right now it felt like the Aces had already moved on, whether they realized it or not. That night, Wilson lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her phone buzzing every few minutes with texts from teammates, reporters, and fans begging for answers. She didn't have any. For the first time in her career, she didn't know what the right move was. She had spent years thinking she'd retire as an ace, that she'd bring more championships to the city, that she'd finish what she started, but now she wasn't so sure. And as more players continued to leave, as Indiana and other teams continued to stack their rosters, as Becky Hammon continued to say nothing, the decision started to feel clearer. Maybe the Las Vegas Aces weren't her future after all. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for Aja Wilson to do what so many of her teammates had already done: leave. The Las Vegas Aces have gone from being a WNBA powerhouse to a team on the verge of collapse. Their players are gone, their coaching situation is shaky, and even their biggest star, Aja Wilson, could be out the door soon. So what do you think? Is this the end of the Las Vegas Aces dynasty? And if Wilson leaves, where should she go next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.